It was a Jekyll and Hyde existence. The way it was and the way I wanted it to be were absolutely two different lives. I wanted one life. I had to have another life.
Hi, my name is Madison, and you are listening to Who's Knocking, a true crime podcast. Welcome back, or welcome. This is part 2 of a 3-part series, so if you're just getting to part 2, I would go back to part 1, although I would listen to this beginning because I have something to say about it. This is part 2 of our series on the Iceman killer, aka Richard Kuklinski. First of all, this episode deals with some pretty extreme themes of domestic violence, so if that is something that bothers you, perhaps think about not listening. Second, in the first episode, I talked a lot about Richard's upbringing and the claims from his first couple murders and everything, and first many murders if you count the New York City murders. And a lot of that came from Philip Carlo's book, which is Iceman, Confessions of a Mafia Contract Killer. I am aware that that book has been largely criticized. And I wanted to really wait till episode 3 to get to all the backlash and the debunking and everything. I still plan on doing that. But I think it's important because this book and everything that he says here and in the Iceman Confessions, those are Richard's claims. So I want to get through all of Richard's claims before we then go back over and talk about whether or not they are true, because many people believe that a lot of the claims are not true, although I think some of them are. I think some people go a little bit too far into thinking that none of it. Anyway, we'll get to it. I promise. It's in part 3. I would love it if you'd let me get there before telling me that it's all wrong, because we will. But I realize it's the internet and people don't watch the whole video, so fair enough. Last week we talked about Richard's childhood, his parents who were super abusive. We talked about when he then decided that he was no longer going to take it and he was going to become a violent person himself, and how he got into contract killing, how he spent a lot of time in New York City murdering people. And then we left on he kind of ended his relationship with Carmine and decided to no longer be a murderer. And he was working at a warehouse. And that is where he met Barbara Pedrici. Now, Barbara was 18 years old. She was very pretty and tall. She was very confident. She was sheltered, and she came from a really nice, pretty nice Italian family. Now, Barbara's mother was a pretty cold woman who, I don't think it's that she didn't care about Barbara, but it's that she seemed to not really care too much to be a mother. It sounds like, the way it's been described, that she sounds like she's like a pretty depressive person. I think maybe she suffered from depression undiagnosed, but I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, so probably shouldn't be diagnosing anybody. But anyway, she kind of just like did her thing. She like came home, laid in bed, and like didn't get involved too much in the raising of the children. But her sister raised Barbara. And Barbara had a pretty good life with her aunt, and she, at age 18, got herself as a job as a secretary in the same warehouse that Richard was working. The boss at that place apparently took a pretty big liking to Barbara because she reminded him so much of his own daughter, and so she had a nice working relationship with this guy. And so one day, this boss apparently saw Barbara and Richard talking in the hall, and they had, it was just like a casual thing. And he was not happy about this at all. He understood Richard to be a very violent individual, and he knew Barbara to be like a very sheltered young girl. Richard was quite a bit older than Barbara, and this just did not sit well with him at all. So this boss fella went up to Richard and basically told him to stay the hell away from Barbara and not to bother her, as she was the epitome of purity and innocence. As anyone could predict, Richard did not take this well. He was super offended. He hadn't thought anything of allegedly. He hadn't thought anything of Barbara to begin with, but how dare anyone tell him who he could and couldn't pursue. And because Richard said all of this to his boss, he was fired on the spot. Then when Richard came back that afternoon to pick up his remaining paycheck, he ran into Barbara and he told her exactly what happened. And Barbara was shocked about this. She felt awful. She had no idea that any of this was going on, that somebody was being fired on her behalf, and she wasn't even aware, so she was very taken aback by this. So she invited Richard out for coffee after work. And that would prove to be the biggest mistake of Barbara's life. Now, it was not Barbara's intention to date Richard, but as soon as they started getting to know each other, Richard was hooked instantly. He couldn't believe what an innocent and I guess kind of like classy girl Barbara was. Richard seemed to be under the impression that all women were basically whores, and he was shocked to find that Barbara was a virgin. He could not believe that, and that she was so kind and funny, and she wouldn't so much as let him kiss her on the first date, which he thought was just so classy. Richard had never really pursued a woman in his life in any meaningful way, and he really did not know what he was doing in that realm. He just decided that he wanted to have her. He started showing up at her house with flowers and presents and basically would not leave her alone from that point on. And that was his goal, and he was going to stop at nothing to achieve it.
He was absolutely flowers at the door every day and considerate and romantic and all of the things that anybody could hope for, dream for. He bought me beautiful things. We went fun places. He was happiest when we were together. He was happiest when just he and I were together.
At first, her family was pretty off-put by Richard. They thought he was much too old for her. I think he was about 5 or 6 years older than her. And she was only 18 years old, so she was quite young. They were also upset that he was not Italian. They were a very traditional Italian family, kind of. And the aunt even went so far as to get the police to look into him because she had her suspicions about him. And they did find out that he did have a violent reputation among law enforcement. Very little actual criminal history. Again, no proof of any murders that he claims to have committed, but Barbara kind of brushed this off, and eventually Richard really just forced his way in. He kind of really clawed his way into the family when he spent Christmas with Barbara's family for the first time. So Barbara invited him to spend Christmas with them, which for her, it was just, an average Christmas, which is usually awesome. I don't know about everybody, but Barbara's family had a very lovely Christmas tradition. They had the tree, they had the food, they had the family, everything. And Richard was just in complete awe of the whole thing. His own family never did anything for Christmas. It was just another awful day in the abusive Kuklinski home. But with Barbara's family, it was like a 2-day long feast. There was a crazy amount of Italian food, presents, they sang Christmas carols, they laughed and chatted and had a wonderful time. And Richard could not believe what he was being included in. The best part for Richard was just that the family took him in, they welcomed him, and they included him in everything. And they got him gifts. Apparently when he arrived, he didn't even bring them gifts because he didn't know that that's what you were supposed to do. But the second day he went out and got gifts for everybody, and he was like Santa Claus, giving people things and loving it, and it was awesome. Richard had apparently never experienced such warmth, such love, that by the end of the 2 days, Barbara found him standing in her backyard weeping out of just love, or what he thought was love. Anyways, that Christmas sealed Barbara's fate in a very unfortunate way. After that, things were all right, but Barbara was starting to feel completely smothered. Richard was like a nice guy. He was very handsome, and he clearly liked Barbara very much, which is great, but he literally never left her alone. She was not able to see her friends anymore. She wasn't able to do anything she wanted on her own anymore, which is what she had done her entire life. She decided that when Richard picked her up from work that day, which he did every day, she would sit him down and try to tell him that she wanted to cool things down a little bit, that maybe she wanted to see other people and not be with him constantly. That day when Richard picked her up, she started to tell him that. Now, mind you, Barbara was like, she is a very like self-confident, sure of herself young woman. She's not like a meek girl in any sense, and she clearly was not the type of girl who like needed a guy, right? So just that's her personality going into this. So she started to tell him that she wanted her space, that maybe she wanted to see other people, and Richard was not having this. He did not like that one bit. He actually, as she was saying this, he took out a knife and like stabbed her in the back of her neck. And she was like, what the hell are you doing? And she started freaking out and yelling, and he ended up choking her until she passed out. And when she came to, they were driving along, and Richard just tried to pretend that nothing had ever happened. But Barbara was horrified. And he ended up telling her in that car that if she were to leave him, if she didn't want to be with him anymore, that he would kill her whole family. And Richard was not messing around, and he was serious about that, it seemed to Barbara. And that's when Barbara realized that Richard was definitely that he was not right. I don't want to say that she realized he was a psychopath, because I don't even know if she knew what that was at the time, but it terrified her. Because she believed what he said. So after she came to from the choking incident, he tried to pretend that everything was fine, and he made it very clear that he and Barbara were going to be together, and that was that. Barbara went home, and she didn't know what to do. She's 18 years old, and she was terrified that her family would be essentially murdered if she were to leave this guy. The next day, Richard apologized profusely. He told Barbara what a wonderful life they would have together, that they were going to get married and have children. You know, Barbara's young and naive, and she does want those things. So she kind of just let it be for the time, and I think probably just tried she tried to go with all the good things about Richard and tried to let him be romantic when he was romantic, and just tried to forget about the time he stabbed her in the car. She really didn't know what to do. And Richard just wedged his way into Barbara's family even more. Even though they were all apprehensive about him at first, they all grew to really like him. He could be extremely charming. And even in front of her own family, apparently, Richard would hit Barbara. And I guess that was somewhat normal at the time, because no one really cared, which is completely enraging when you think about it. I can't imagine a situation in which my husband was hitting me in front of my own family. Like, they would have a riot. But I guess that was okay at the time, which is, I just hate that. Anyway, so then Barbara became pregnant, and this really solidified the relationship, and Richard, at the behest of the aunt, finally got an official divorce from Linda, and he married Barbara. And it wasn't long into their marriage that Barbara had her first miscarriage. Now, usually it's very difficult. First of all, miscarriages are extremely common. If you're unaware, miscarriages happen in like 1 in every 4 pregnancy. And usually they're just, the most common situation is just there was maybe some sort of chromosomal abnormality, or for whatever reason, chemically, the pregnancy just wasn't going to create a normal child. Sorry if that's offensive. I don't know. Barbara miscarried this baby the day after Richard got upset with her during the night for some reason, and he made her sit out on a metal stool on the porch for the entire night. Out of pure fear, Barbara did that. And shockingly, the next day she had a miscarriage. Was that the reason she had a miscarriage? I can't prove that, but it seems like quite the coincidence. Barbara had accepted the physical violence. She felt that her only option was to leave him, and that the consequences of that would probably be her own death or the death of one or more of her family members. So she chose to stay. And although Richard beat Barbara and put her down constantly, Barbara maintained her feistiness. She talked back to Richard when he beat her. She called him a bully. She didn't let him turn her into a shell. And according to Barbara, the couple did have good times. As much as Richard could be an out-of-control abuser, he could at other times be a wonderful and loving and attentive husband. But Barbara really wanted to have children, and of course, she did fear for their safety with Richard as their father. Now, one night, she sat him down and she told him that if he ever so much as laid a finger on one of their future children, whatever she had to do, she would do it in order to murder him. She would poison his food. She would kill him in his sleep. Didn't matter. He would not get away with physically abusing their children. And Richard silently accepted those terms, shockingly. Now, after 3 miscarriages at the hands of Richard and Barbara went on to have 3 children together. I'll just say on the miscarriages, and Barbara claims that he pretty much beat her until she miscarried. And he wanted the children. So it was out of rage, and I guess he would say an uncontrollable rage, that he would beat her and she would suffer a miscarriage. And one of those miscarriages was at 5 months. So that's a full ass baby at 5 months that he killed in her womb. So after the 3 miscarriages that he knew were his fault, he really tried very hard to restrain himself and not beat his pregnant wife so that she could then have 3 children. And that did end up working out. So as soon as they had their very first daughter, named Merrick, Richard was ecstatic, as was Barbara. Richard loved his children. And with his children, he was, I wrote gentle, but I think that's the wrong word. But he was a loving and attentive father. And even in the beginning, as when Barbara saw that, she got a little glimmer of hope that maybe having children would change Richard. But that never does happen, does it? That hope died very quickly. Richard was loving towards his children. It's a very complicated thing, and I think of a lot of people who've never experienced domestic violence, again, myself included. It's very hard to understand, and we will get to some footage of the children talking about Richard and Barbara talking about Richard, and you'll see there's various levels between all of them because it was like he was 2 different people, and we discussed that a little bit before. He could be a great dad, but then if he was mad, he would be a monster. He did never hurt his children physically, but he still had an absolutely violent temper, and he was able to divert his outbursts onto furniture and other objects, and Barbara, who absorbed most of the physical abuse, all of the physical abuse, if you don't include objects. And that seemed to keep him from actually harming his own children. But I don't think he definitely didn't realize the psychological harm that he was doing to them regardless. He just thought, I'm not hitting them, so, like, it's fine. But it's like, you're hitting their mom in front of them. And, like, when I say, like, he hit Barbara, he didn't just hit Barbara. Like, he broke her nose on multiple occasions. He broke ribs. He knocked her out. Like, he beat the shit out of this woman. Richard claims that once he started having children, he stopped doing all of his, randomly killing people or getting too mad and killing people. He knew he needed to smarten up, stop drinking so much, and take less risks because he wanted to have his family, and he wanted to be a good dad and to provide a life for his children that he never had. But the stresses of raising a family of 5 began to mount. By the way, he had his first daughter, Merrick, and then he had a second daughter, Kristen, and a son named Dwayne. Quickly, it became too many mouths to feed, especially given the lack of employment skills that he had and the lack of financial planning skills. So in order to make enough money, he started working at a film lab. And there they produced regular movies as well as apparently pornographic films. And this place was pretty sketchy. It seemed like a lot of the owners were kind of going behind each other's backs and pirating movies to shop around. And so Richard decided to get in on this action, and he reached out to some of his old mafia acquaintances and started selling pirated porn to the Gambino family. And this was a decent little gig for a while. Richard worked many hours at the film lab, did a lot of overtime. His claim is that there was a lot of gross bestiality porn, and there are people who on the internet claim that there was kitty porn and stuff, which he would obviously deny as he was not into harming children. Again, we'll get into a lot of the claims and debunking in the third episode. it did seem super sketchy, and he was making money under the table or whatever. Now at home, things were starting to have a really similar feel to Richard's childhood. Barbara began to understand that there were two very distinct sides to her husband. Sometimes, most of the time actually, Richard was super sweet and very loving and a solid, good partner, and he could be counted on to be a protector and a provider. The other side of this guy was horrific. Completely different person who appeared out of nowhere and took out his anger on her physically, and it seemed to be random to the family because Richard could get angry about something during the day. For instance, like a coworker or a stranger would say something to him that bothered him, and he would stew in that rage for the entire day and let it bubble up inside of him until he arrived home, and he would take it out on Barbara. He'd wait until somebody in the home made a very slight mistake, like maybe Barbara overcooked an egg or didn't put a sandwich together properly or wasn't watching a child and the child hurt themselves. And then he would get so crazy mad at her and beat the shit out of her, and it obviously sucked. Remember, this is exactly what Richard's father did, and that he hated so much. He would very arbitrarily beat his entire family. So Richard got to a point where he was continuing the cycle that his father was probably continuing from his father, and his father was continuing from his father. His family were his punching bags, and I mean, not literally with his children, but psychologically, they received the brunt of all of this abuse, and every day for them, it was like walking through a landmine.
When he would be raging, he would punch himself in the head, and you could actually see he would be so red in the face, and his blood vessels would be popping out, and he'd hit himself, and you'd see the vibration that he would hit so hard. We would beg him to stop and say, "Stop, Daddy, don't hurt yourself," because we didn't want him to hurt himself. We wanted this behavior to stop, but we had, I guess, gone through it long enough to know that there really wasn't anything that we could say that was gonna make it stop.
I walked around on eggshells with my dad, or in our house in general. I think I still walk on eggshells. I don't think I really know how not to. God, I haven't thought about that in a long time. And, I'm sorry.
But then Richard spoiled his kids rotten and bought them whatever they wanted, a true marker of a loving parent. One of his goals as a parent was to never let his children know true poverty the way that he had. I would assume that he also thought in some way that his generosity might make up for his abuse. So it just, to a child, though, that's so confusing.
My father was very big on taking out the motion picture camera. It was very important for him to have these memories as proof. See, this is my family. See, look at the smiles. We're all really happy. Look how good my kids are dressed. This is great. Look at my car. It was all very important things for him to show.
Now, it's Richard's claim that soon enough he began murdering people again. Constantly, not as a hitman, but just there was some instances where his rage got out of control and he murdered people. Nobody suspected Richard in any of these murders. Nobody asked him a single question. Again, we'll get to it. They're technically unproven. I still do think especially if any of these murders were true, it may not be typical serial killer behavior. He's not deriving any sort of sexual gratification out of these murders, but it does seem like he was getting some sort of release out of these murders. I do think that is serial killer behavior. In the family, Richard had a particularly close relationship with his oldest daughter, Merrick, who, through conversations with Richard, grew to believe that his outbursts were really beyond his control, and she didn't hold any of his behavior against him at the time. And in her eyes, Richard could really do no wrong, which is so upsetting. And as she got older, Richard began to treat Merrick as a little confidant. He would confide in her and confess things to her, definitely not realizing the severe damage he was doing to her by doing this. And so they had a very close relationship. Richard's younger daughter, Kristen, did not feel the same way. She particularly resented her father for beating her mother. Regardless, she loved her father. He was the only father she'd ever known. But it was very clear the divide between the two sisters Merrick sided with Richard and Kristen sided with Barbara. Yet another horrific, very toxic culture within the family. And Dwayne, like, kind of never really shows up anywhere. I don't think he ever did much, like, interviewing after the fact. I don't know where he sat, but he was the youngest brother. I kind of assume that all the women had to take on the, like, adult roles in the home and that Dwayne didn't. But I also don't want to assume. I'm going to play some clips of the daughters from the ID show I Lived with a Killer, where both of them were interviewed about their life with their father, specifically about the two distinct roles that they played within the family. Listening to them recount this is, like, super upsetting. This first clip is Merrick explaining the time that Richard told her about, remember I talked about the first murder he'd ever committed in episode 1, the boy in his neighborhood. So for context, this clip is her recounting the time when Richard told her about that incident when she was 13 years old.
My dad, when he was younger, growing up, he was very tall. His clothes didn't fit right. So there were neighborhood bullies. They used to, like, push him to the ground and call him names and so on and so forth. And then he explained that he was going in his house, go to hang up his coat, and saw the coat rod and just took it out. And then it turned into that he used the rod to kill the boy. I don't think I processed it. I said to my father that I understood and that I loved him.
And here's Kristen discussing her role within the family.
I believe that it was my job in the family to keep my mother alive. There were many times when my father would be hurting my mother and we wanted him to stop. So at one point I stood in between him and my mother and he was right in my face and he said, "Kristen, I'm going to ask you to move." And I said, "But Daddy, you know I can't. I don't want you to hit Mommy. I want to, protect Mommy." And he said, "I'm going to ask you one more time, Kristen." And I said, "I can't do that, Daddy." And he put his hands on both my arms and just picked me up and put me like 3 feet to the side and put me back down and then proceeded to hit my mother. So it was like I wasn't even there. I may have slowed him down. That was about it.
And this is one of the most messed up things I have ever heard of a parent putting onto a child. This is a lot.
I think I was 13, and he said, "Mary, if it goes too far and I ever kill your mom, that I would have to kill all of you." And that he wanted me to know that I would be the hardest because of our relationship. And I said, "It's okay, Dad. I understand."
Just imagine your own terrifying father sitting you down to tell you that he may in the future have to kill you and your entire family. The burden, the psychological trauma that poor child must have taken from that one conversation, let alone all the others that led up to that and preceded that, is on another level, okay? And your father is supposed to be the one person, or two, your mother as well, in the entire world who you as a child can trust to protect you at all costs. A father should be willing to give up his life for a child without a second thought. And here Richard is telling his own daughter, who he claimed that he loved completely unconditionally, that his life was more important than his wife and children's. He's telling her that if I screw up and kill your mom, it's more important that I live and don't get caught than all of you survive. And I really want to get into the psychology of Richard in the next episode, but Richard does not love his family. Richard maybe thinks that he loves his family, but Richard does not know what love is. There's no way, because if you're a father who who truly loves your family, you would never say shit like this. It couldn't cross your mind. So it's a fascinating example of how crossed the wires are in this man's brain, that he does truly believe that he loves his family. But this is not love. This is nothing like love. And poor Merrick, she accepted that. She accepted this as a possibility, and she told him that she loved him. That has to be one of the most fucked up things I've ever heard. Like, at least top 5. I don't know about you. I can't imagine. Because, like, literally, I have 3 children. I've said this many times before. There are times during the day, I also have a very morbid mind because of stuff like this. Like, on many occasions, sometimes I'll just stop during the day and be like, yeah, I'd take a bullet for my kids. Like, in a second, if it came down to their life versus mine, without question, I would give up my life for theirs. Not even a second thought. Obviously, if I didn't have to, like, I wouldn't. But, like, if it came down to it, that's your job as a parent. So to hear him say that is just really upsetting. There's a lot of speculation, and a lot of people believe that a lot of the stuff that Richard says is unfounded or not true or proved otherwise. I do buy what the family says. This is the family's recollection. This is like the daughters saying what happened in their home. Obviously, they could be lying, but I take their word much heavier than I do, obviously, Richard's. They were not murderers. He was a murderer. He definitely is a murderer. Now, just to add some layers to this whole thing, I would like to tell you what became of Richard's brother, Joseph. And this is going to take it back a little bit to 1970. So, I'm talking about when the kids are teenagers. That would be mid-70s. Yeah, that would be mid-70s. But just a little bit before that, there was a horrific incident with Richard's brother, Joseph. So it was in September of 1970 that Joseph Kuklinski, I think, really kind of hit rock bottom. He was unemployed and poor, and I'm sure suffering from a myriad of undiagnosed mental health issues stemming from his very horrific childhood. His childhood was very similar to Richard's. Obviously, he grew up in the same house with the same horrible father. So this night in September of 1970, Joseph was wandering around his neighborhood, drinking, being drunk, and he ran into 12-year-old Pamela Dial. Pamela was a nice young girl. She did well in school. She was very small for her age. She was petite and very cute. And she had a little dog named Lady who followed her around wherever she went. Earlier that night, Lady had gone missing. She'd, gotten out of the home and was running around the neighborhood. And while her parents were busy watching the 11 o'clock news, Pamela left the house to go search for Lady. Her parents were not even aware that she'd left. Now, Pamela found Lady, and she was headed home where she ran into Joseph Kuklinski. As I said, Joseph was drunk, and he asked Pamela if she wanted to spend some time alone with him. Now, Joseph was known around the neighborhood, and Pamela was clearly not afraid of him. And, like Richard, he was like a decent, good-looking guy. Don't think that 12-year-old Pamela knew what Joseph meant when he asked her to hang out, but she did say yes. So Joseph took her to the roof of a nearby apartment building, which was 4 stories, and there he attempted to have sex with her. Rape her. And she refused, so Joseph forced himself on her, and he did rape her and sodomize this 12-year-old little girl, and he choked her till she died. After he had killed her, he tossed her off the roof into a neighboring backyard, and then he took the dog and threw him off the roof as well. Now, the dog did not die. He suffered from some broken bones, but then he pulled himself over to Pamela and screamed and cried until somebody called the police with a noise complaint, and they showed up and found poor Pamela's dead body and her beloved dog in distress and injured. So this was obviously just, I can't even imagine, horrible. And it wasn't long before the police were able to piece things together. There was an eyewitness who placed Joseph and Pamela together earlier, and they brought him in and started interrogating Joseph, and he just started admitting to everything and told them what he had done to Pamela. Now, Joseph was very similar to Richard in that he viewed the world as inherently violent and cruel. He lacked empathy for others, and he had no problem enacting violence on other people. Where he differed from Richard was this moral code that Richard had, where he was not interested in harming children. And Richard did everything he could to cover up his own crimes and to not get caught. Richard seemed to be smarter than Joseph. Joseph had way less to lose than Richard did. Richard had his family who he cared for in his own way, in his own sick way. Joseph had nothing. He didn't have so much as a girlfriend. He had no family, so he, I would assume, is, again, not a doctor here, but seems to have psychopathic tendencies, probably some severe depression that just makes him not give a shit. Again, not a doctor. Kind of a doctor, but not a doctor. Initially, Richard wanted to help Joseph. He set him up with a lawyer and, helped him with money and was visiting him in jail. But once Joseph admitted to Richard what he had done to Pamela and that it was all true, what they were saying about him, Richard did not like this at all. Pamela was a young, innocent girl, very much like his own daughters. And Richard was, at that point, done with Joseph. He didn't want anything to do with him anymore. He couldn't believe what Joseph had done to Pamela. To Richard, he did not have a brother anymore. Joseph was just dead to him at that point. Richard also no longer had anything to do with his mother, who had been in his life for a little while and had interacted with Barbara and the daughters and everything, and Barbara really didn't like Anna. She was just a very unpleasant person all around. And Richard also didn't have anything to do with his sister, who he felt was a whore. I don't know a whole lot about her or whether this was a reasonable opinion, but he pretty much kind of cut the rest of his family off at that point. He was just disgusted with them all. Richard was doing decently at the film lab, doing a bunch of porn pirating. The Gambino family, he claims, were good clients of these films, and so that was satisfying for a time. Now, Richard was doing pretty well at the porn lab, the film lab that made porn. Now that he was back with these organized crime guys again, apparently, not that reluctantly, got back into being a hitman and killing for them. And, just other mafia-related jobs. Richard has talked about how much he loved being a hitman, how he enjoyed the planning of it, and just the fact that he was good at it. He just found the job very satisfying, and obviously it paid very well. He made a lot of money. He had a lot of money. Richard says that he began to get very innovative with his killings and disposals. He started using, so he obviously was into he would shoot people and stuff. He said that he would take people and because he was a really, really big guy, so he would take people and hoof them over his shoulder and hang them over the back of him. That was one way that he would kill people. He would choke people to death. But he did start using a very innovative method, allegedly, involving cyanide. And we know that he did kill people with cyanide. So he would either drop it in people's food and drinks, and they would pretty much drop dead almost immediately after. But he also started using it in a spray form, where he would pretend to sneeze on somebody or pretend to spill a drink on them, and the cyanide would interact with their body and kill them pretty instantly, because cyanide does kill pretty instantly, and cyanide is a pretty horrific death. But what it does, it mocks a heart attack. So a lot of the times, if people die of cyanide poisoning, you could think that they had died of a heart attack. And now I think cyanide is pretty easy to spot if you're looking for it, but especially back then, cyanide was not super easy to detect, especially if you were not looking for it, and especially if the death looked like it was a natural cause situation. That's especially an effective way of killing people if you're just going to leave their body. Richard also began to freeze bodies and keep them frozen for a number of years and then leave them out in the open for somebody to find. And the fact that he froze them was to confuse police and trick them into thinking that this was like a fresh dead body. And this process earned Richard the nickname Iceman. But it would also lead to his inevitable downfall, which I will tell you a little bit more about next week.
You willing to go out on a contract?
If the price is right, I'll talk to anybody.
Yeah?
Sure.
And you mean to tell me your way is nice and clean and nothing fucking shows up?
Well, it may show, my friend, but it's quiet. It's not messy. It's not noisy. It's not,
Yeah, but how the fuck do you put it together, like, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, there's always a way. There's a will, there's a way, my friend.
So that's where I'm going to end it this week. Please just let me get to the third episode, and that is when I will talk about all the reasons why people believe a lot of this is not true. Some people think that all of this is true. Some people think that half of this is true. Some people think that none of it is true. There is some evidence for some of the murders, but a lot of his claims are really dubious. And we will get into all that and decide what we think, and I'm sure everybody will agree 100%. So please come back next week. Please leave me a comment, but also please just let me finish before you tell me that it's all wrong, because I know. And please stay safe, because you never know who's knocking. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Lost Line Media. Artwork by August Digital. Music by Matthew Cook.